The massive exhibition hall stretched across 3 levels of the Galactic station, filled with displays from hundreds of alien worlds. Jake Morrison walked slowly through the crowds, his hands in his pockets, feeling slightly out of place among beings that looked like they stepped out of fever dreams. Some had tentacles instead of arms, others floated in bubbles of liquid. A few were just clouds of glowing gas that somehow managed to operate the display terminals. Jake was 32 years old, a metallurgist from Colorado who never imagined he would be representing Earth at something called the Galactic Council Technology Exposition. 5 years ago, humanity discovered they were not alone in the universe. 5 years ago, first contact changed everything. Now here he was, wearing his best suit and trying not to stare at the 8-legged creature selling something that looked like living metal. The human section was small and tucked in a corner. Earth brought samples of steel alloys, some titanium composites, and a few advanced ceramics that the scientists back home thought might impress someone. Next to the displays from civilizations thousands of years older, their booth looked like a high school science fair project. Jake had spent the morning answering polite but clearly unimpressed questions from alien metallurgists who patted him on the head, metaphorically speaking, and moved on to more interesting exhibits. Now he wandered, curious about what these ancient races had accomplished. The Vrelnian booth showcased crystals that could hold their shape under pressures that would crush diamonds. The Harmonious Collective displayed metals that repaired themselves when damaged. Each display was more impressive than the last, and Jake felt Earth's inadequacy settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Then he reached the center of the grand hall and stopped walking. A crowd had gathered around a raised platform where an alien was giving a demonstration. The being stood about 7 feet tall with a segmented body covered in dark blue plates that looked like polished stone. Multiple eye stalks protruded from what Jake assumed was the head, each one moving independently. 4 arms ending in delicate manipulators worked at a forging station that glowed with contained energy. Jake pushed through the crowd to get a better view. A sign near the platform identified the demonstrator as Master Craftsman Velshah of the Korthian Empire, a species that had mastered metallurgy 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years. Jake tried to wrap his mind around that number. 12,000 years ago, humans were just figuring out agriculture. Velshah worked at his forge with movements that looked like a carefully choreographed dance. Energy fields surrounded a blade as he shaped it, and Jake could see layers forming in the metal, each one perfectly aligned. The translator device everyone wore rendered Velshah's clicks and whistles into English. The harmonized titanium platinum alloy before you represents the peak of metallurgical science, Velshah explained to the audience. Each molecular layer is precisely aligned using quantum manipulation during the cooling process. This blade will maintain its edge for centuries without any maintenance. The technique requires technology that takes millennia to develop and perfect. The crowd murmured appreciation. Several beings in the audience took notes on devices that floated in the air. Jake studied the blade more carefully. The layers were visible along the spine, creating a subtle pattern. It reminded him of something, a memory tugging at the back of his mind. Velshah finished his demonstration and held up the completed blade. It caught the light and seemed to glow from within. The precision required is beyond what younger species can comprehend. This blade contains 47 distinct molecular layers. Each layer is exactly 1,000 atoms thick. My calculations indicate this represents the theoretical maximum for functional blade construction. Any attempt to create more layers results in structural instability. Jake raised his hand. The movement felt small and human among the alien crowd, but Velshah's eye stalks swiveled toward him. Yes, the human observer has a question. Master Velshah, I was wondering about those layers, Jake said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. You said 47 layers is the maximum? Correct. The quantum bonding process cannot maintain structural integrity beyond this number. It is a fundamental limit of physics. Jake pulled out his phone. Back home, people laughed at him for still carrying an old-fashioned smartphone when neural implants were becoming available. But Jake liked having something physical in his hand. He scrolled through his photos until he found what he was looking for. His Uncle Pete had sent him pictures last month of his latest project. Can I share an image? Jake asked. Velshah gestured with one of his 4 hands, and Jake's phone synced with the demonstration display system. The image appeared on the large screen surrounding the platform. It showed a knife with a blade about 8 inches long. The steel had a distinctive watery pattern flowing across its surface. light and dark bands swirling together like smoke frozen in metal. The crowd leaned forward. Dozens of eyes, eye stalks, visual sensors, and things Jake could not identify focused on the image. The hall fell completely silent. "What is this?" Velshaw asked. His tone had shifted from confident lecturer to genuinely curious scientist. "This is a Damascus steel blade," Jake explained. "My Uncle Pete makes them. He is a retired electrician who lives in Montana. This is his hobby. He does it on weekends in his garage." Someone in the crowd made a sound like bubbling water, which the translator interpreted as laughter. Others joined in with clicks, whistles, and sounds that had no earth equivalent. Even Velshaw's body segments rippled in a way that suggested amusement. "I mean no disrespect to your uncle," Velshaw said, his tone patient like a teacher addressing a confused student. "But those patterns are clearly decorative etchings. They are quite beautiful, but they do not represent true metallurgical layering." Jake swiped to the next image. This one showed a cross-section of the blade under magnification. The layers were clearly visible, hundreds of them stacked together, each one distinct. He swiped again, bringing up the metallurgical analysis that Pete's friend at the university had done as a favor. The data showed carbon distribution, crystalline structure, hardness measurements, and layer count. The laughter stopped. The hall went silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Heavier, confused, a crystalline being near the front spoke up. Her voice chimed like wind through glass. "The analysis shows 384 distinct layers. But humans do not possess quantum forges. Your species barely has basic fusion technology. How is this possible?" "We fold it," Jake said simply. "You take 2 or more different types of steel and stack them together. Then you heat them up until they are almost melting. Then you hammer them together. The heat and the hammering force the steel to bond at the molecular level. Then you fold the whole thing over and do it again. Each time you fold, you double the number of layers." He pulled up another image showing the process step by step. "Start with 2 layers. Fold once, you have 4. Fold again, 8. By the time you fold 10 times, you have more than 1,000 layers. My uncle usually does 12 or 13 folds for his knives." Velshaw moved closer to the display, all 4 of his manipulator arms reaching out as if to touch the projected image. His eye stalks extended to their full length. "You are describing manual force bonding at the molecular level using only thermal energy and kinetic impact. The precision required would be the temperature control alone." He trailed off, and Jake heard the translator struggle to find English words for whatever the Korthian was saying. Finally it settled on, "This should not be possible with your level of technology." "The temperature has to be just right," Jake agreed. "Too hot and you burn out the carbon, which makes the steel weak. Too cold and the layers will not bond properly and the whole thing falls apart. Uncle Pete uses a forge he built himself from an old propane tank. I think he spent maybe $200 on the materials." More confused sounds from the crowd. $200 translated to about the cost of a simple meal and galactic credits. It was nothing. Less than nothing compared to the sophisticated equipment Velshaw used. Jake pulled up more pictures. His uncle was not just skilled, he was an artist. Each blade Pete made had unique patterns depending on how he folded the steel, how he twisted it, how he ground and etched the final piece. Some looked like flowing water. Others resembled wood grain or feathers or storms captured in metal. "I have been studying metallurgy for 400 years," Velshaw said quietly. "I have trained under masters from 6 different species. I have written 17 books on quantum forging techniques. And you are telling me that a retired electrician creates comparable work in his garage as a hobby?" "Honestly, sir, I think his work might be better," Jake said. "Those patterns are not just pretty. They represent different types of steel with different properties all bonded together. The high carbon layers are hard and hold an edge. The low carbon layers are flexible and prevent the blade from breaking. You get the benefits of both in one piece." Velshaw was quiet for a long moment. His eye stalks moved independently, studying the images from different angles. Finally he spoke. "I do not mean to offend, but I must see proof. Direct analysis." News of the challenge spread through the station faster than Jake expected. By the time he returned to the human quarters that evening, his phone had 57 messages waiting. His supervisor back on Earth wanted a full report. The human ambassador wanted to know if Jake had lost his mind. 3 different news organizations wanted interviews, and Uncle Pete had sent a video message that started with him laughing so hard he could barely speak. Boy, You just bet Earth's reputation on my garage hobby. Pete wheezed in the video, wiping tears from his eyes. That is either the bravest or the stupidest thing I have ever heard. Probably both. Your aunt says I should have taught you better, but I am proud as hell. Do not mess it up. Jake sat on his bunk and replayed the video twice, drawing comfort from his uncle's confidence. Pete had been making blades for 30 years. If anyone could teach the technique in a few phone calls, it was him. Jake had helped in the forge last summer during a visit home, but he had mostly just watched and asked questions. Now he wished he had paid closer attention to every detail. His roommate and colleague, Beth Collins, knocked on the doorframe. She was a linguist, not a metallurgist, but she had become Jake's closest friend during the mission to the station. She carried 2 cups of coffee and wore an expression that was half concern and half amusement. You know the betting pools have you at 50-1 odds against? She said, handing him a cup. The smart money says you will produce something that looks nice but fails the structural tests. The really pessimistic bets say you will not produce anything at all. Jake sipped the coffee. It was terrible, made from synthesized beans that approximated Earth coffee without quite achieving it. What are you betting? I put 20 credits on you, Beth said. If you win, I buy drinks for a month. If you lose, well, we will probably get shipped back to Earth in disgrace, so drinks will not matter much. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Hey, I saw those pictures. Your uncle does good work. The question is whether you can do good work. She sat down on her own bunk across from him. Are you scared? Terrified, Jake admitted. I am about to try to replicate a skill that takes years to master, and I'm going to do it in 3 days in front of hundreds of alien scientists who all think I am crazy. Yeah, I am scared. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Beth pulled up something on her datapad. I did some research on Velshaw. He is kind of a big deal. He has 400 years of experience, written books that are standard texts in metallurgy across a dozen species, and he has never been wrong in a public prediction. Not once in 4 centuries. You are really making me feel better here. I am just saying you picked a hell of an opponent. But here is the interesting part. Every article about him mentions his integrity and his genuine love of learning. He is not setting you up to fail because he wants to humiliate humans. He really wants to know if what you claimed is possible. If you can show him something new, he will be the first one to celebrate it. Jake finished his coffee and stood up. Then I better make sure I have something to show him. The council is setting up a workshop tonight. I should go check the equipment and materials. The workshop was in a converted cargo bay on the station's industrial level. When Jake arrived, he found a space about 30 feet square with excellent ventilation and more observation cameras than he could count. The walls were lined with screens showing different angles of the workspace. A dozen alien technicians were still installing equipment. Velshaw was there, supervising the setup. He turned when Jake entered, his eye stalks focusing one by one. Human Jake Morrison, I wanted to ensure you have everything required. I am not interested in winning this challenge on a technicality. I appreciate that, Jake said. Can I look at what you have set up? Velshaw gestured with one of his 4 arms. The workshop contained a furnace capable of reaching the necessary temperatures, an anvil that looked like it was made from some kind of dense alien metal, and a variety of hammers and tools. The steel billets were stacked nearby, 3 different types that Jake could use for the layering. Jake picked up one of the hammers. It felt wrong in his hand, too light and oddly balanced. Are there any simple steel hammers available? These look like they are made from that fancy harmonized alloy. They are the finest smithing tools available, Velshaw said, sounding slightly offended. I am sure they are amazing, but I need something more basic. The weight and balance matter for the hammering technique. Do you have anything that is just, a lump of steel on a stick? One of the technicians, a floating jellyfish-like being, made a sound like wind chimes. The translator rendered it as surprised confusion. You want inferior tools? I want familiar tools, Jake corrected. Or at least tools that work the way I am used to. The hammer is part of the process. If it does not feel right, the work will not come out right. Velshaw considered this. There are basic fabrication tools in the general workshop. Crude implements used for rough work. I will have them brought here. He paused. You are teaching me something already. I always assumed superior tools produce superior results. You suggest the craftsman's familiarity with the tool is more important than the tool's technological sophistication. Both matter, Jake said. But yeah, I would rather have a basic hammer I understand than a fancy one I do not. Uncle Pete uses hammers his grandfather used. They are old and worn and probably worth nothing, but Pete knows exactly how they will respond to each strike. Over the next hour, they made adjustments to the workshop. Jake tested the furnace and found it too precise. It maintained exact temperatures using computer controls, which sounds ideal but actually was not. Damascus forging required reading the steel's color and adjusting the heat accordingly. Jake needed to be able to make the furnace hotter or cooler quickly. "Can you switch it to manual control?" he asked the technician. "But then the temperature will fluctuate. That is the whole point of the automated system. The fluctuation is part of the process. I need to be able to respond to what the steel is telling me." More confused looks from the technicians, but they made the changes. Jake also requested a bucket of water, some oil for quenching, and a wire brush. Simple things, but essential. Felshaw watched each request with growing interest. "You are stripping away precision and adding unpredictability," the Corthian observed. "This seems counterintuitive for delicate work." "It seems that way," Jake agreed. "But Damascus forging is not about controlling every variable. It is about understanding the material and working with it. The steel wants to do certain things at certain temperatures. My job is to recognize what it wants and help it do that, not force it into something against its nature." Beth arrived with dinner, which she had picked up from the station's human-compatible food court. It was synthetic meatloaf, somehow worse than the coffee. They ate while Jake went over his plan, talking through each step. "First day I will do the initial welding and start the folding process. That is the most physically demanding part. 7 or 8 folds should give me enough layers to work with. Second day I will finish the folding and start shaping the blade. Third day, final shaping, heat treatment, and finishing. If everything goes right, I will have a completed blade by the end of day 3. And if things go wrong," Jake shrugged. "Then I learn what not to do and Earth becomes a joke in the galactic community. No pressure." By the next morning, word about the challenge had spread beyond the exposition. The observation gallery above the workshop was packed with alien scientists, diplomats, and curious onlookers. Jake recognized representatives from at least 20 different species. Some had traveled from other parts of the station specifically to watch. The screens showed camera feeds from a dozen angles, and Jake knew these feeds were being broadcast to other parts of the galaxy. Belshaw arrived precisely on time, accompanied by 3 other master craftsmen from different species. One was a gelatinous being that pulsed with different colors. Another looked like a collection of metallic rods that somehow moved and thought. The third was covered in fur and had 6 arms. "These are my colleagues," Velshaw explained. "Master Krentoth of the Harmonious Collective, Specialist Vrix of the Machinist Collective, and Artisan Felnara of the Woven Worlds. They wanted to observe your technique." Jake nodded to each of them, not sure what the proper greeting was. "Glad to have you. Fair warning, this is going to look pretty simple and maybe even boring. Damascus forging is not fancy." "We shall see," Krentoth said, the gelatinous being's colors shifting to what the translator called polite skepticism. Jake took a deep breath and picked up the first steel billet. Time to prove that sometimes the old ways work just as well as the new ones. He carried the steel to the furnace, placed it inside, and fired it up. The metal began to heat, glowing first red, then orange. In the observation gallery, dozens of beings leaned forward to watch. Cameras recorded every moment. Somewhere back on Earth, Jake knew people were watching. He thought about Uncle Pete in his garage, about the generations of bladesmiths before him, about 2,000 years of accumulated knowledge and skill. The steel reached the right color, a bright orange yellow that Jake recognized from his summer in Pete's forge. He pulled it out with The rhythmic sound of hammer on steel filled the workshop for hours. Jake fell into the pattern that Uncle Pete had taught him during those long summer days in Montana. Heat the steel until it glows the right color. Pull it from the furnace. Place it on the anvil. Strike it with steady, measured blows. Watch it elongate and flatten. When it cools too much and turns dull red, back into the furnace it goes. Then repeat the whole process again. By noon of the first day, Jake's arms ached. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the workshop's climate control. He had forgotten how physically demanding this work was. In Pete's garage, they took breaks to drink beer and talk about fishing. Here, Jake felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching his every move. The observation gallery stayed packed all morning. Some beings left and others took their places, but the crowd never thinned. Beth brought him water and a protein bar during a heating cycle. "How is it going?" "Good so far," Jake said, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "The steel is cooperating. I was worried the alloy composition might be different from Earth steel, but it is behaving pretty much how I expected. The aliens are taking a lot of notes. Felshaw has not moved from his spot in 3 hours. I think his eye stalks are getting tired from tracking your movements. Jake glanced up at the gallery. Sure enough, the Korthian master stood in the same position as when they started. All 4 of his arms crossed in what might have been concentration. The other master craftsmen surrounded him, occasionally leaning together to confer. "What do you think they are saying?" Jake asked. "Probably trying to figure out if you actually know what you are doing or if you are just hitting metal and hoping for the best." Jake laughed and took another drink of water. "Some days I wonder that myself. Uncle Pete always said that half of bladesmithing is confidence. The steel can tell if you are uncertain, he claims. I think he might be crazy, but his blades turn out perfect, so maybe there is something to it." The steel reached temperature again. Jake set down the water and returned to work. The billet was now about twice as long as when he started and roughly half as thick. The surface showed slight texture from the hammer blows, and the color was consistent across its length, which meant the heating was even. "Time for the first fold," Jake announced to the cameras. In the gallery, the crowd pressed closer to the viewing windows. Jake took the hot steel and used a cutting tool to split it partway down the middle, about 2/3 of the way through. Then he bent it, folding it back on itself. Where there had been 1 layer, now there were 2. He sprinkled a light powder between the layers before closing the fold completely. "That powder is called flux," Jake explained, knowing the cameras would pick up his voice. "It keeps the steel from oxidizing while it is hot. Oxidation would prevent the layers from bonding properly. Uncle Pete makes his own flux from borax, but this is a commercial mixture that does the same thing." He placed the folded steel back in the furnace. This was the critical moment of the first fold. The 2 layers needed to heat evenly and reach exactly the right temperature for welding. Too cool and they would not bond. Too hot and the steel would burn and become worthless. Jake watched the color change through the furnace opening. The steel went from dull red to bright orange to the yellow orange he needed. He pulled it out and returned to the anvil. The first hammer blow on a fold always made him nervous. This was where bad things could happen. If the weld did not take, the layers would slide apart. If there was contamination between the layers, weak spots would form. The hammer came down. The steel responded with the right sound, a clear ring that Jake had learned to recognize. He worked across the weld line, encouraging the layers to bond. Heat, pressure, and time would forge them into a single piece. After 20 minutes of careful hammering, Jake held up the billet and inspected it. The weld line was barely visible, which was a good sign. He let it cool enough to handle and then took it to a grinding wheel to clean up one edge. The cross-section showed 2 distinct layers bonded together. "First fold successful," Jake said to the cameras. "1 more fold and I will have 4 layers. 3 more after that and I will have 32. This is the basic process. It is simple but time-consuming." Velshaw's voice came through a speaker system. "Human Jake Morrison, a question if I may. How do you know the layers have bonded adequately? What measurement or test confirms the weld quality?" Jake held up the billet to the cameras. "I look at it, and I listen to how it sounds when I hit it. A good weld has a specific ring to it, a clear tone. A bad weld sounds dull or makes a kind of clicking sound. The steel tells you if the weld is good." "The steel tells you," Felshaw repeated slowly. "You are describing intuitive assessment based on sensory input rather than measurable data." "I guess so, yeah. I mean, you could probably scan it and measure the molecular bonds or whatever, but that would take time and you would need to wait for the steel to cool. This way I know right away if I need to do the fold again or if I can keep going." There was a long pause. Then Krentoth spoke, the gelatinous being's colors shifting to deep purple. "This seems impossibly imprecise. You are creating molecular-level bonds using only auditory and visual feedback." "It works," Jake said with a shrug. "Humans have been doing it this way for a couple thousand years. Once you learn what to look for and listen for, it becomes natural. Like I bet you could tell if something is wrong with your equipment just by how it sounds, right? Same principle." The second fold went faster. Jake was warming up now, literally and figuratively. His muscles remembered the motion from last summer. The steel was behaving predictably. By the time he completed the second fold, giving him 4 layers, he felt confident enough to speed up his pace slightly. The afternoon became a blur of heat and hammering. Third fold, 8 layers. Fourth fold, 16 layers. Each time the process was the same. Elongate the billet through hammering. Heat it to the right temperature. Make the fold. Flux the layers. Weld them together. Repeat. By evening, Jake had completed 7 folds, giving him 128 layers. The billet had transformed from rough stock into something that already showed hints of the pattern to come. Where he had ground the edges to check the welds, the layers appeared as fine lines stacked together. The steel had a different quality now, a subtle texture that came from the folded structure. Jake's arms felt like they might fall off. His shoulders burned. His hands were cramping despite the gloves he wore. But he looked at the billet with satisfaction. Day 1 was complete, and everything had gone according to plan. Beth met him at the workshop entrance with more water and actual food this time, something that looked like chicken but probably was not. "You did good today. The aliens are very confused, which I think means you are succeeding." "Confused how?" "They keep running scans of the billet between sessions. The molecular analysis shows perfect layer bonding, exactly like you would get with their quantum forges. But you are doing it with fire and a hammer. It breaks their understanding of what is supposed to be possible." Jake ate the maybe chicken and tried to rub feeling back into his forearms. Pete always said the best technology is the kind that does not need an instruction manual. Fire makes steel hot. Hitting hot steel makes it change shape. Hit it enough times in the right way and you get something useful. Humans figured that out a long time ago. They walked back to the human quarters together. The station was busy with evening activity. Aliens of every description moved through the corridors going about their business. Some stopped and stared at Jake as he passed. Word had clearly spread about the human who was challenging Master Velsha. In the quarters, Jake found more messages waiting. Uncle Pete had sent another video, this one showing him in his forge working on a blade. "See this right here?" Pete said in the video, holding up a piece of steel. "This is the exact same fold you will be doing tomorrow. Watch how I flux it, see that? Not too much, not too little. Just enough to do the job. You got this, nephew. Make me proud." Jake watched the video 3 times before bed, studying every detail of Pete's technique. The way he held the hammer, the angle of the strikes, the judgment of when the steel was hot enough, all the little things that made the difference between success and failure. The next morning, Jake arrived at the workshop to find the observation gallery even more crowded than before. Apparently, word about Day 1 had generated more interest. He also noticed several news crews with professional recording equipment. This was becoming a bigger event than he had anticipated. Velsha was waiting with his 3 colleague masters. The Corthian approached Jake as he prepared the forge for Day 2. "Human Jake Morrison, I must admit something to you. Last night I reviewed the recordings of your work and the scan data from your billet. The layer bonding is perfect. Not adequate, not acceptable, perfect. I cannot identify any difference in quality between your manual welds and what my quantum forge produces." "That is good news," Jake said cautiously. "It is troubling news," Velsha corrected. "I have spent 4 centuries perfecting techniques that you replicate with fire and physical force. Either my understanding of metallurgy is fundamentally incomplete, or humans possess some quality that allows you to achieve precision." Day 2 began with Jake doing something that confused everyone watching. Instead of immediately continuing the folding process, he took the billet and twisted it. Not much, just a quarter turn along its length while the steel was hot and malleable. Then he straightened it partially, leaving a spiral tension locked into the metal structure. Velsha, standing now at a safe distance near the anvil instead of up in the gallery, tilted his head in the way that meant curiosity. "Why introduce structural stress? This seems counterproductive." "This is how you create the pattern," Jake explained, rotating the billet to show the twist. "When I continue folding and then grind the blade to shape, this twist will make the layers intersect at different angles. That creates the wavy pattern you saw in Uncle Pete's knives. Different twisting and folding techniques create different patterns. So the decorative appearance is actually a natural result of the structural process," Krentoth observed from nearby. The gelatinous being had also descended from the gallery to watch more closely. "The form follows function and the function creates form." "Exactly," Jake said. "The pattern is not just for looks. It actually tells you something about the steel's structure. An experienced bladesmith can look at a Damascus pattern and tell you how many folds it has, what kind of steel was used, and how it was heat-treated." He placed the twisted billet back into the furnace and continued the folding process. 8th fold, 256 layers. The billet was getting harder to work now because the steel was becoming denser with each fold. Each hammer blow accomplished less deformation than before. Jake had to heat it more carefully and work it more deliberately. The 9th fold took over an hour, By the time he welded those layers together, he had 512 distinct layers of steel, all bonded at the molecular level through nothing more than heat and pressure and time. Jake ground one edge clean and held it up to the light. The layers were so fine now that they looked almost like silk threads running through the metal. 512 layers, Specialist Vrick said, the metallic being's rods clicking together in what might have been amazement, created through 9 iterations of a simple process. The elegance is remarkable. Uncle Pete usually does 12 or 13 folds, Jake said. That gives you 4,000 or 8,000 layers. But for this demonstration, I think 10 folds will be enough. That will give me just over 1,000 layers, which should make the pattern really clear. The 10th fold was the hardest. The steel resisted now, dense and compact. Jake had to heat it longer and hotter, and his hammer strikes had to be perfectly placed to move the metal effectively. Sweat dripped down his face despite the workshop's temperature control. His shoulders screamed in protest with each swing of the hammer, but the steel cooperated. Slowly, gradually, the fold took shape. The layers welded together one final time. When Jake finished and checked the cross-section, he counted 1,024 layers stacked together, each one perfectly bonded to its neighbors. The folding is complete, Jake announced, setting down his hammer and flexing his aching hands. Now comes the shaping. He took a grinding wheel and began working one edge of the billet, slowly transforming it from a rectangular bar into something that resembled a blade. This required different skills than the forging. Jake had to maintain consistent angles, create an even taper from spine to edge, and keep the blade symmetrical along its length. Felshaw watched every movement with intense focus. You are removing material from areas that were created through dozens of hours of work. Does it not concern you to grind away layers you worked so hard to create? That is part of the process, Jake said, checking the blade's profile with his eye. You create more material than you need, then shape it down to the final form. It is like sculpting. The statue was always there in the stone. You just remove everything that is not the statue. But how do you know where to remove material? You are working by eye again without measurements. Jake paused his grinding and held up the blade. I am following the steel's lead. See how the layers run here? I want to preserve that flow in the final shape. And this section is slightly thicker because the folding pattern is denser there. I grind the thinner sections less so everything stays balanced. He returned to work, the grinding wheel throwing sparks as it bit into the steel. The blade's shape emerged gradually. Jake aimed for something practical, a utility knife about 10 inches long with a 3-inch blade. Not fancy but functional. Uncle Pete always said a good blade should be a tool first and a work of art second. By late afternoon, the basic shape was complete. The blade had an edge, a spine, and a taper from base to tip. The pattern was starting to show where Jake had ground through the layers, revealing the folded structure beneath. Light and dark bands spiraled along the blade's length, flowing like water frozen in steel. Artisan Felnara, the 6-armed furry being, reached out one paw tentatively toward the blade. May I touch it? It is safe now, Jake said. Not sharp yet, but be careful. The edge is thin enough to cut if you press hard. Felnara ran one claw along the blade's surface, feeling the subtle texture of the layers. Extraordinary. The pattern has depth. It is not surface decoration but extends through the entire structure. All the way through, Jake confirmed. If I ground this blade down to half its current thickness, the pattern would still be there. That is the nature of Damascus steel. The structure is integral. Beth arrived with dinner and Jake took a break to eat. His arms felt like jelly and his back ached from bending over the grinding wheel. But looking at the shaped blade laying on his workbench, he felt satisfaction settle over him like a warm blanket. It was working. Against all odds and alien expectations, it was actually working. You are becoming famous, Beth said, showing him her datapad. The video feeds from the workshop are being watched across the galaxy. There are discussion forums analyzing every hammer blow. Some species are already trying to replicate your technique. Seriously? Seriously. Apparently, the idea that advanced results can come from simple methods is revolutionary to a lot of civilizations. They have been so focused on technological sophistication that they forgot to consider whether simpler approaches might work just as well. Jake ate his synthesized dinner and watched. The sun set through the workshop's viewport, or rather watched the local star set on the alien world below the station. Everything about this situation was surreal. 2 weeks ago, his biggest concern was whether the coffee in the human quarters was stale. Now he was conducting a demonstration that apparently had galactic significance. Do you think Uncle Pete knows about all this? Jake asked. I sent him the video feeds. He is probably watching right now, drinking beer in his garage and yelling advice at his computer screen. Jake laughed at the image. Yeah, that sounded exactly like something Pete would do. The third and final day started with the heat treatment, which Jake considered the most critical phase. This was where the blade's properties would be locked in permanently. Mess up the heat treatment and all the previous work became worthless. Get it right, and the blade would have the hardness to hold an edge combined with the flexibility to resist breaking. Jake heated the blade slowly and evenly, bringing it up to critical temperature. He watched the color change, waiting for that specific moment when the steel's crystalline structure would be ready to transform. Too soon and the treatment would be incomplete. Too late and the steel would be damaged. The color reached perfect orange-red. Jake pulled the blade from the furnace and moved to the quenching tank. This was the moment of truth. He plunged the hot blade into the oil. Flames erupted from the tank's surface. The superheated steel hit the oil and turned it instantly into vapor, which ignited in contact with air. Smoke and fire filled that corner of the workshop. The camera struggled to see through the haze. In the gallery, Jake heard surprised exclamations from the alien observers. The flames died down. Jake lifted the blade from the oil, now dark with quenching residue. He set it carefully on the workbench to cool. His hands shook slightly. The quench was where blades could crack or warp if anything went wrong. He would not know if it had survived until it cooled enough to inspect. 20 minutes of agonizing waiting followed. Jake busied himself cleaning the workspace, organizing tools, anything to keep his mind occupied. Velshaw stood motionless nearby, his eye stalks fixed on the cooling blade. Finally, Jake picked up the blade and examined it. No cracks, no warps. The quench had been successful. He let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. One more step, Jake said. Tempering. He placed the blade in a lower temperature oven to temper it, which would relieve the internal stresses from the quench and bring the steel back from brittle hardness to functional toughness. While it tempered, Jake carved a simple handle from a piece of wood the station had synthesized for him. Nothing fancy, just a basic grip wrapped with leather cord. The blade came out of tempering and Jake let it cool. Then came the final finishing, polishing the steel to bring out the pattern. He used progressively finer grits of sandpaper, working carefully to maintain the blade's shape, while revealing the beauty hidden in the layers. As the scratches from previous grinding disappeared and the surface became smooth, the Damascus pattern emerged in full glory, light and... The testing facility was located in the science section of the station, 3 levels above the workshop. Jake carried his Damascus knife in a simple cloth wrap, following Velshaw and the other master craftsmen through corridors filled with equipment he could not begin to understand. The observation gallery here was even larger than at the workshop, with room for hundreds of beings. Every seat was filled and more crowded the standing areas. Beth walked beside Jake, carrying a data pad to record the results. Nervous? She asked, beyond nervous. This is where we find out if I actually made a functional blade or just a pretty piece of metal. My money is still on you. The testing area contained machines and devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, which Jake supposed they did from a human perspective. Scanning equipment, strength testing apparatus, molecular analyzers, and things Jake could not identify lined the walls. Technicians from a dozen species manned the stations, preparing for the examination. Velshaw stood at the center of the room near a presentation display. He waited for the crowd to settle before speaking. We are here to examine the Damascus steel blade created by human Jake Morrison, using traditional Earth techniques. The testing will be comprehensive and public. All data will be shared in real time with this assembly and broadcast to observers across the galaxy. He gestured to Jake, who unwrapped the knife and placed it on the examination table. The blade seemed small and humble, surrounded by all the advanced technology. We will begin with basic microscopy and work toward more complex analysis, Velshaw continued. The first question is whether the layers the human claims to have created actually exist and are properly bonded. The knife went under a scanning microscope, and the results appeared on screens around the room. The cross-section showed layer after layer after layer, each one perfectly distinct yet seamlessly bonded to its neighbors. The technician operating the scanner was a crystalline being whose entire body refracted light in confusion. The scan shows 1,024 individual layers, the technician reported. Layer thickness varies from 15 to 40 nanometers. Bonding appears complete at the molecular level. No gaps, no inclusions, no defects visible at this magnification. Velshaw leaned closer to the display. Increase magnification by factor of 10. The image zoomed in, showing the atomic structure where two layers met. Even at this scale, the bond was perfect. The iron atoms from one layer interlocked with atoms from the adjacent layer, like two pieces of a puzzle fitting together seamlessly. This should not be possible, Krentoth said, the gelatinous being's colors shifting to deep purple confusion. The bonding quality equals what we achieve with quantum forges that control atomic placement. The human used fire and impact force. How does imprecise application of energy produce precise atomic alignment? The atoms want to bond, Jake said, aware that his explanation would sound ridiculous to these advanced scientists. When you heat steel to the right temperature, the atomic structure becomes mobile. The atoms seek stable positions. Hammering provides energy and pressure that helps them find those positions. It is not about forcing them into place. It is about giving them the opportunity and the encouragement to find their natural arrangement. The steel wants to bond, Velshaw repeated slowly. You describe the material as having intention. Not real intention, Jake clarified. But think of it like water flowing downhill. The water does not choose to flow down. It just does because that is what water does. Steel atoms at high temperature seek stable bonds because that is what atoms do. My job is not to control every atom. My job is to create the conditions where the atoms can do what they naturally do. There was a long silence in the testing facility. Finally, Artisan Felnara spoke up. The human describes working with material nature rather than against it. This is a philosophical approach we abandoned millennia ago in favor of direct control. Perhaps we discarded wisdom along with simplicity. The testing continued. Hardness measurements showed the blade averaged 58 on the Rockwell scale. Hard enough to hold an edge, but not so hard it would be brittle. Toughness testing revealed excellent resistance to impact and stress. The blade could flex significantly without permanent deformation or fracture. Edge retention test, Velshaw ordered. They placed the knife in a machine that would draw the edge across various materials while measuring how much the edge degraded. The blade cut through rope, wood, synthetic materials, and even some softer metals. After 500 cutting cycles, they examined the edge under magnification. Edge shows minimal dulling, the technician reported. Approximately 5% reduction in sharpness. The layered structure is creating a self-sharpening effect. As softer layers wear away, harder layers are exposed beneath, maintaining cutting ability. Velshaw picked up the knife carefully and turned it in his manipulators. The Damascus pattern caught the light, flowing across the blade's surface. This edge retention rivals my own quantum-forged blades. In some metrics, it exceeds them. And the human achieved this in 3 days using equipment that cost, what did you say? Uncle Pete's whole forge setup cost maybe $1,500, Jake said. Including the anvil, the hammers, the fuel tank for the forge, everything. You could probably do it cheaper if you scrounged for used equipment. More shocked sounds from the gallery. $1,500 was roughly equivalent to 100 galactic credits, less than the cost of the analysis equipment being used to test the blade. Krentoth pulsed with rapidly changing colors. The economic implications are staggering. We spend millions of credits on quantum forging equipment and facilities. Entire industries exist to support our metallurgical technology. And you suggest comparable results can be achieved with basic tools and human labor? I would not say it is easy, Jake cautioned. It takes years to develop the skills. Uncle Pete has been doing this for 30 years and he still says he is always learning. But yeah, if you have the knowledge and the patience, you can make Damascus steel without fancy technology. Velshaw set the knife back on the examination table. Run the full crystalline structure analysis. I want to see how the different steel types are arranged at the atomic level. The deepest scan yet began, mapping the blade's atomic structure in 3 dimensions. The results appeared on the screens as a complex lattice of different crystalline forms interwoven together. High-carbon steel with its hard, wear-resistant structure alternated with lower carbon steel that provided toughness and flexibility. The layers created a composite material that combined the best properties of both while minimizing their weaknesses. This is materials engineering at the highest level, Specialist Vrick said, the metallic being's rods vibrating with what might have been excitement. The human has created a functionally graded material through purely mechanical means. We attempt the same thing with computer-controlled deposition systems that cost fortunes and require constant calibration. The pattern is also aesthetically sophisticated, artisan Felnara added. The spiral layering creates visual harmony that reflects the structural harmony beneath. Form and function unified through process rather than design. Jake watched the alien scientists circle his knife, studying it from every angle with instruments and sensors. He thought about Uncle Pete in his garage, probably watching this broadcast and laughing at the fuss everyone was making. Pete would say it was just a knife, nothing special, just another weekend project. But Jake understood now that it represented something more important than one blade. Belshaw called for quiet in the testing facility. The Korthian master stood beside the examination table, his eye stalks focusing on Jake. Human Jake Morrison, I challenged you to prove your claims about Damascus steel. You have exceeded my expectations in every measurable way. This blade matches or surpasses the quality of my quantum-forged work in every performance metric. He paused, and Jake felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching. More significantly, you have taught me something I did not expect to learn at my age. I have spent 400 years pursuing technological sophistication in metallurgy. I believed that advancement meant more precise control, more complex equipment, more detailed measurement. You have shown me that sometimes advancement means understanding so deeply that control becomes unnecessary. Belshaw picked up the Damascus knife one more time. I formally acknowledge that human metallurgical techniques, despite their simplicity or perhaps because of their simplicity, produce results comparable to galactic standard methods. More than that, I acknowledge that my understanding of metallurgy was incomplete. I had forgotten that our ancestors across many worlds began with fire and hammers. They built knowledge over generations, learning to read materials and work with them. In our rush to develop technology, some of us lost that intimate understanding. The Korthian master turned to address the gallery. I propose the Galactic Council establish a comprehensive cultural exchange program focused on traditional human techniques. Not just metallurgy, but all crafts and skills where humans have developed sophisticated methods using basic tools. We should learn from Earth before we teach Earth. They may be technologically younger, but in some ways they remember things we have forgotten. The gallery erupted in discussion. Some beings seemed excited by the